So I will turn this meeting over to Dr. Judy.
Okay, when I was first rereading Oration on the Dignity of Man, I really thought there were a number of salient points. I mean, so many that you could read it and reread it and still read it again and not comprehend everything about it. But what struck me were these three quotations that we are all gods and sons of the Most High. And of course, sometimes what some Christians have done, and even Jews, is to interpret this as a capital and with a genitive that, well, we're the sons of God. But Pico is actually saying in the oration that we are inherently gods. And this world we see as the cosmic dwelling of divinity, that it is in this world that the divine exists in us and we exist in the divine. That's a wonderful quotation that Truth picked. And then, of course, what a miracle is man. And this really is something that Hermes is said to have said to Asclepius. And now I'm going to go to the next slide. And this is, of course, one of the pictures of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. It's on the internet, his great profile. And incidentally, I wanted to say, to this very day, you cannot baptize a child in the Catholic Church Giovanni Pico because it's the name of a heretic. And he was officially declared a heretic, even though he insists upon being Catholic. His idea of being Catholic is really being universal, which what the word meant. It did not mean the universalization of the Apostles' Creed, which is a dogma. Now, this phrase that begins is one of the first lines in the oration. What a great miracle is man, Asclepius. Hermes is said to have said this to Asclepius, who is the god of healing. But I think these gods were actually ancient adepts, and that they were beings who, through the struggles that we're all going through, attained to a very high estate. So Asclepius is the great teacher about healing. And I love this quotation, which God says to Adam, the Adam Kadmon, the universal man, that we have made of thee neither of heaven or of earth, neither mortal nor immortal, so that with freedom of choice and with honor, as though the maker and molder of thyself, thou mayest fashion thyself in whatever shape thou prefer, thou shalt have the power to degenerate into the lower forms of life, which are brutish. Thou shalt have the power out of the soul, thy soul's judgment, to be reborn into higher forms, which are divine. So, of course, this, even to begin with, is heretical in the Catholic Church, because it's not saying that we are just little beings that a God made and that we're going to go to either heaven or to hell, depending on how good we are and depends on how much time we'll spend in purgatory. He's saying that, in a sense, we are our self-fashioners, that our free will is not limited by the knowledge of God, knowing what we're going to do, which became a terrible part of philosophy called Calvinism after the Reformation, and that we can attain to higher forms, divine, angelic forms. So this is just to begin with another shocker to a very devout Catholic who isn't thinking very much. Now, I want to say something also about the organization that Pico was a member of, because it has directly to do with the 7th century plan. And we know that in 1375, Song Papa really declared that we needed this knowledge to come to be worldwide to the West. And there was a great scholar, Marsilio Ficino in Italy, who was a friend of Cosimo de' Medici, who happened to be interested in Plato. Now, we know the Medici were not very nice. They killed a lot of people, they poisoned a lot of people, and they were the princes of Florence, especially Lorenzo de' Medici was the Prince of Florence, to which Machiavelli's great dissertation, The Prince, is dedicated. And we know about Machiavelli's philosophy is that that anything can be done to keep the prince in power, but it's always the subordinate or the fall guy that takes the rap and is executed in the public square, whereas the beloved prince remains remote. And of course, this sounds a little bit familiar to what's happening today. Then Machiavelli was pretty smart, and he wrote some very important works. But this Florentine Academy, they think this is the building where it was held, in a place called Carigi, right outside of Florence itself, and that it appeared to be just a library and an academy. The important thing about it, though, is that Ficino was a Platonist. Pico della Mirandola is essentially a Platonist, although he thinks Plato and Aristotle can be reconciled. In fact, he's so syncretic, Pico thinks just about everybody can be reconciled in universal brotherhood. But they didn't all agree with each other. There's Lorenzo di Valla, who's a member of the Academy. He was strongly Aristotelian. And he starts out a discourse and says that philosophy is the instigator of heresies. And then he, of course, goes on to give a philosophical dissertation. So I think they tried to veil a lot of what they were doing. They were doing it very quietly behind the scenes. And I think that is very important because they didn't want to come to the attention of the church. Now, there are just a few things about Ficino I want to say, because he was so important to Pico. He was an older man, but he survived Pico by 5 years. Pico didn't live very long, as we know, because he was poisoned. But he's most known for the Theologica Platonica and Concerning the Mind. And he's also known for the basic Renaissance idea of humanism, that man can attain the highest states of the good and self-conscious immortality. And this is such an important idea because there are many people who think that humanism, and this is because of modern day ignorance, really means that, well, everything just depends on us, little people who are simply advanced apes, and after all, there isn't any God or anything. Well, that's exactly the opposite of what Renaissance humanism is saying, or what humanism originally meant. It meant man is really himself capable of attaining to the state of either, we would say, angelic immortality or beatific state. And from the essay Concerning the Mind, Ficino says the object and the end of the mind is the attainment of truth and goodness, Platonic. The origin and end of the soul is none other than infinite truth and goodness. That the mind is much better than the sense to attain its desired end, and at some time the soul can attain its desired end and good. So it's a very optimistic work that Ficino, who had a big influence on Pico, really, I think I've skipped ahead accidentally on the slides. Let's see, how do I go back? Not quite sure how to do this.
You have a reverse arrow?
Yeah,
you can use the arrow keys. The left arrow will take you back.
The left arrow, is that up above?
The arrow keys down on the keyboard, down on the keyboard of the computer, those arrows. You hit the left arrow and it'll do it. It's
I
not
don't know
something
what
you
it is.
find with, it's not something you're finding on the screen. It's
Well,
something you're finding.
let's go back.
There you
Oh,
go.
wait a
That's
minute.
all.
No,
That's all.
I think we're okay.
Yep.
Okay. No, all right. This is one is all right. I also just want to say about Renaissance humanism that there were also German humanists as well as Dutch humanists like Erasmus of Rotterdam. It's just too much to go into all this, but Louis Spitz of Stanford, whom I knew very well, writes that in Rucklein's Kabbalism, man is viewed as a unique creature situated at the center of the great chain of being, able to descend or ascend until united with the one, as in Neoplatonism. And the goal of both the Kabbalah and Pythagoras is to lead the souls of men back to the gods. Rucklin remarks that Ficino produced Plato for Italy, Lefebvre d'Estaples restored Aristotle for France, and I shall complete the number and show to the Germans Pythagoras reborn through me. Well, this man was not humble, but he was important. And I had an ongoing argument with Louis Spitz when I was up at Stanford that the Florentine Academy and Renaissance humanism were much more important than the Protestant Reformation. And the reason is that the Protestant Reformation was extremely important economically because Luther, who had guts, did pronounce, "Here I stand." He said in the church in Wittenberg in German, "Hier stehe ich kann nicht anders, Gott hilf mir." Here I stand, I can do nothing else, God help me. And he was cheered by all these German nobles because they weren't going to have to pay duty to Rome anymore. So this started an economic boom in Northern Europe, whereas Southern Germany remained Catholic. But what was the difference between Lutheranism and Catholicism? Not much. Luther threw out the intercession of the saints. The Pope was no longer the head of the church. Well, the Christ is the only mediator according to Luther. But there was no more intercession of saints as the Catholics pray to, and he eliminated the Jewish Apocrypha from the Bible. He translated the Bible into the vulgar language of German, the Luther Bibel, which is quite beautiful. But we can argue about Christian theology later if you want to. But let me get to Pico directly. Also, I couldn't resist this about Ficino also, because this is also directly important in Pico's thinking. And it's just so true that the soul is always miserable in its mortal body. Ain't it the truth? Okay, we know by experience that the beast in us most often attains its end and good. And of course, this would be, eating, sexual fulfillment, pleasures and such. But this seems to be the most unfortunate. Prometheus, instructed by the divine wisdom of Pallas, he gained possession of the most heavenly fire, that is reason. Because of this very possession on the highest peak of the mountain, at the very height of contemplation, he is rightly judged most miserable of all, for he is made wretched by the continual gnawing of the most ravenous vultures, that is, by the torment of inquiry. This will be the case until he's carried back to that same place from which he received the fire, so that as he is now urged on to seek the whole by that one beam of celestial light, he will then be entirely filled with the whole light. And this is from Marsilio Ficino and is quoted in Concerning the Mind, Renaissance Philosophy of Man, edited by Ernst Cassirer and Paul Oscar Christeller and Joseph Randall. Okay, well, let's get to Pico. Let's see if we got the right one. Okay. I don't know what happened to that. Okay, here we are. Well, Pico was born in 1463 and somewhere in Tuscany, and we know he died of poisoning on the auspicious date of November 17th, 1494, the day the French took over Florence, actually. He studied in Padua with Rabbi Elia del Medigo of Crete and Averroes Aristotelian. And a lot of this comes from Andalusian Spain, where many of these brilliant Sephardic Jews were quite in touch with Arab intellectuals who were also Aristotelians and Neoplatonists. And for a boy, Catholic, to be accepted by so distinguished a rabbi who would really usually only teach Jewish men who were 40 and very learned. This is extraordinary. He had to be a genius. At any rate, after he did this study, he befriended Marsilio Ficino and Angelo Poliziano, who were Neoplatonists in Florence. He wrote his 900 disputations against the Catholic Church in 1486. Now, this oration on the dignity of man, which I hope some of you heard, delivered in English in modern form on the internet, because I just thought it was great. I love listening to it, even though it takes over an hour. It was never delivered by Pico. He was only 24. He was already well known, but Pope Innocent VIII wasn't about to let it be delivered at a conference in 1487, because these 900 disputations, which are sort of synopsized in the oration, were considered, at least 13 were considered blatantly heretical. So it never got delivered, even though it's a brilliant oration. And in fact, because of this heresy, he was in trouble, and he fled to Paris, where he was briefly arrested, and Lorenzo de' Medici, who had a lot of influence, got him out. So, I mean, the Medici weren't all bad, but they were mostly pretty awful. But they did have some good ideas that supported the Florentine Academy. Okay, so other things to say about Pico, that he also wrote quite early in his life a document called Heptapolis, Sevenfold Account of the 6 Days of Genesis, which is sort of the beginning of what might be called Christian Kabbalism. And I know H.P. Blavatsky quotes a Christian Kabbalist named Eliphas Levi in the Secret Doctrine and other places as being very important. Pico also wrote on Being and the One and Platonic Metaphysics. He wrote disputations against divinatory astrology. Now, this doesn't mean that Pico wanted to throw out all astrology, but I think what he's against is any kind of determinism, which would say that it's just written in the stars what's going to happen to you. There are many Elizabethan types who believe this, and there's nothing you can do about it. He didn't agree with that at all. Earlier, we don't know at what time, he's said to have been involved with an affair with a woman named Margarito, who was the wife of Giuliano de' Medici, and he was again rescued by Lorenzo from jail. I'm not quite sure what time this occurred, but he was essentially rather an ascetic person. He never married, so I'm not sure if that's true or whether that's a rumor. But he got called to the Inquisition, but was found dead of poisoning with his friend Pomponazzi. And oddly enough, this body wasn't exhumed until 2007 from a tomb, and there was proof of poisoning found in the remains, even after all that time. And according to his nephew, this is Gianfrancesco Pico, he spent his last years in silence and asceticism, gave away much of his estate to his nephew, and really did not plan on any further public discourses. So let's go on to some of the oration itself. Let's see, I've got to go to the next slide. Okay. Some of the central points of the 900 disputations, which are in the oration that man is the maker and molder of himself, that you can't buy time out of purgatory for yourself or anyone else. Luther argued against this, and also got in trouble for it. Luther actually was working against a man named Tesla, who said you could actually buy time out of hell, or you could actually confess the sin that you were about to commit and be forgiven. The church later cleaned up its act on that. Okay, he also says the Kabbalah has validity in Christian doctrine. The different spellings of the Kabbalah are because there are all these different spellings of the transliteration of it. Okay, and he says, as Catholics, we can learn from Greek, Muslim, Zoroastrian, and Jewish sources. Humans can rise to the level of divinity. There's a religious truth syncretic to all true religions and philosophies. And he mentions this about true religions because there are false things about some religions, and he probably more than hints that man can be reborn in a Pythagorean kind of metempsychosis. He's very keen on Pythagoreanism and Platonism, and I think no doubt that that Pico was initiated into the ancient mysteries along with Ficino and probably many of the other people in the Florentine Academy, although they didn't all agree with each other. And that's also an important thing about an academy. You don't just want a bunch of people who agree. Okay, so quotes from the oration, I think that are magnificent, and I just want to put them up for discussion and to think about. If vegetative, he will become a plant. If sensual, he will become brutish. If rational, he will reveal himself as a heavenly being. If intellectual, he will be an angel, a son of God. And if dissatisfied with a lot of creatures, he should recollect himself into the center of his own divinity. He will be there, become one spirit with God in the solitary darkness of the Father, who's above all things, himself transcend all creatures. This creature, man, whom Asclepius, the Athenian, which indicates that Asclepius was at one time perhaps an evolving human being, they became a god, said was symbolized in the mysteries by figure of Proteus. This is the source of those metamorphoses so celebrated among the Hebrews, among the Pythagoreans, for even the esoteric, those of the Hebrews at times transforms the holy Enoch into the angel of divinity, Malach HaShekinah, which would mean the angel of the Holy Spirit, actually. Okay, let's go to the next slide then. This is all from the oration. Okay, now this is also from the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, which is originally written as Torah, law, Nebiim, prophets, and Ketuvim, writings, such as the Book of Kings and the Psalms and Job, etc. And the Christians rearranged the Bible in order to have it all point toward the Messiah, ending with Micah. So in Psalm 82, a psalm of the prophet Asaph, you are all gods and sons of the Most High. I had taken you for divine beings, sons of the Most High. That's another translation of it. Well, in other words, if you make this into a genitive, then of course it has a different meaning. But to Pico, obviously, it is a meaning that we are inherently gods. And Pico teaches that philosophy is knowledge of the soul, in particular, the soul's ascension to God through self-knowledge. Know thyself, which is nothe oeton in the Greek, invites and exhorts us to the study of the whole of nature, of which man is the connecting link and the rational portion. For he who knows himself knows all things in himself Zoroaster first, and Plato and the Alcibiades wrote. Part of my text is cut off here. Enlightened. Wait a minute. Okay, this is very sensitive. Enlightened through knowledge, through the aid of natural philosophy, being already to God, employing the theological salutation of thou art. We shall blissfully address the true Apollo on intimate terms. And this is page 29 of the Correggio translation of Oration on the Dignity of Man. There are several translations, of course, which actually, oddly enough, the oration was not translated into English, I read, until 1944. Now, another tremendous passage from the oration is, finally, Pythagoras will command us to feed the cock. That is, to nourish the divine part of our soul with knowledge of divine things, as with the substantial. I'm cut off from part of my own text and heavenly ambrosia. This is the cock who's.
Anything you want me to help read, I'm happy to do it.
How do I cut this off with the arrow on the left? Oh, okay. I think I got it. Yeah.
Great.
Okay. At this cock's crowing, when man returns to his senses, this is the cock which every day with the stars of morning raises the Te Deum, to the deity, to heaven. This is the cock which Socrates at the hour of his death, when he hoped he was about to join the divinity of his spirit to the divinity of the higher world, and when he was already beyond danger of any bodily illness, said that he owed to Asclepius, the healer of souls. That's page 30 of that translation. And I think this is absolutely wonderful because remember when I was in Amsterdam, I was on a tour, and the docent said that the churches that had a cock rooster on top were the Protestant churches. So they took up this idea too, that this was the dawn of the new age. And I don't know if any of you have ever had a rooster, but I used to, and he used to sing at dawn. Although some people didn't like it, but I liked the rooster very much. His name was Charlie, and he would actually sing when the sun was coming up. And it was wonderful. And of course, Asclepius is the healer of souls, and that's why Socrates is saying that he wants his friend Crito to sacrifice to Asclepius, because being dead, he won't be able to do it. But that means he's being healed from the evils of this life. Okay, so let's talk about Pico on philosophy. This is right out of Stoicism. He says, philosophy has taught me to rely on my own convictions rather than on the judgments of others, and to concern myself less with whether I am well thought of than whether I am well thought of, than whether what I say or do is evil. And that is right out of what Epicurus says, that there are things in our power and things not in our power, and what other people think of us isn't in our power. We do the best we can. So Pico also says that, theosophy leads really to magic. I have also proposed certain theses concerning magic, in which I have indicated that magic has two forms. One consists wholly on, sorry about the typo, the operations and powers concerning demons, and consequently appears to me, as God is my witness, an execrable and monstrous thing. The other proves, when thoroughly investigated, to be nothing else but the highest realizations of natural philosophy. The term magus in the Persian tongue means the same, according to Porphyry, as interpreter and worshiper of the divine. In our language, philosophical dialectic leads to theurgy, or communication with angelic beings. And that's my commentary, because philosophy ultimately through a dialectic, we have to go back here, is going to lead us to a higher state. Now, regarding the Christian religion, Pico absolutely insists that he's a Catholic. And of course, by that, he means universal. And I remember Father Virgil Cordano, who was a very fine man and a Franciscan priest. And in him, one of his last addresses in Santa Barbara, he said the word Catholic really does mean universal and that we should love all people. Well, the chair of Catholic Studies at UC Santa Barbara is named for Father Virgil. And I think that's his last incarnation as a Catholic, just to comment on that. But Pico here, it refers to Origen that we talked about earlier in this series. Origen asserts that Jesus Christ, the teacher of life, revealed many things to his disciples, which they in turn were unwilling to commit to writing, lest they become the common possession of the crowd. Dionysius the Areopagite gives a powerful confirmation of this assertion when he writes that more secret mysteries were transmitted, but the founders of our religion, ek nu eis dia meson logu. I just don't have a Greek font, so I transliterated it. That is, from mind to mind without commitment to writing, through the meeting of springs of understanding. That is the fable theology of the supersubstantial deity, the fountain of wisdom, that is the precise metaphysical doctrines concerning angelic forms and the stream of wisdom. So clearly, he is a Christian, but he also is a Neoplatonist Christian. Okay, so I just going to come to a few conclusions. Of course, Pico is a Hermeticist. He's a Neoplatonist, but he's also a Kabbalist. As I said, he studied with a distinguished Kabbalistic rabbi, and he thinks it's compatible with the Christian Trinity. Well, we know in the Kabbalah there's the Ein Sof, the no thing, the ineffable behind all. Sorry, I thought I'd corrected that typo. And in the 10 Sephirot, which you've all probably seen, it's been reprinted in the Secret Doctrine. There's the Keter, the crown, which is in a sense the Ancient of Days, I think mentioned in the book of Daniel. There's the Holy Spirit, which is the Shekinah, the Sabbath Queen, which in the Kabbalah is the heart of everything that's interconnected, the Tiferet, and Adonai, the creator of male and female, Yod, He, Vav, He, the Hebrew letters. And they never say what the name of God is. The Hebrews won't do it. They don't like the JWs because of that and other reasons. Well, of course, there is a Messiah to come, and Judaism, the Spirit is always present. And also, Pico says that Plato and Aristotle are reconcilable on the immortality of the soul. Well, I think the reconciliation could go like this, but there's also a differentiation. It's very clear that Plato in the Phaedrus, when he talks about that which moves itself and is not moved by anything else prior to it, is immortal, and the human soul is of such a nature, and that therefore the human soul is immortal. I'm giving you just a synopsis of that argument you'll find in the great dialogue Phaedrus, in which Socrates questions disciples. And with Aristotle, of course, everything begins with what is called the unmoved mover. Well, this fits in a little bit more with Catholic doctrine that there is a beginning and the soul is sempiternal, not eternal, that God's the creator of souls. And Aristotle also says that part of the soul in Dionima is not immortal, but some of it is immortal. And Pico says that, these two ideas are reconcilable in the sense that certainly our physical body, our astral. Pico seems to know about the astral. He's clearly an initiate. Uh, these are not immortal, but there is a higher part of us which is immortal. So he thinks Plato and Aristotle can be reconciled. Some of his colleagues at the academy were Aristotelian. They didn't all agree. And of course, there is the very important idea that we are in God and God is in us, and that we have to realize that in ourselves. And at the end of the oration, which I didn't get a time to really do a slide on, but he invites the Reverend Fathers to do battle with him. He realizes that they might want to argue about this. Well, they did more than want to argue. They cut him off and probably killed him. And so I think we need to discuss this because, of course, there may be ways in which you disagree with me about what I've said about the oration. And it's an immense work. So I'm going to stop the screen sharing unless any of you want me to go back to any other slides. Okay. Because I'd like to see you all again. Yeah, all right. Okay. I don't know why the screen sharing is not stopping. Okay, I'm going to stop share.
There you go.
Okay, here's everybody. Okay, so I think Marlon had a question.
You'll have to unmute yourself, Marlon.
Yes, thank you. Oh, gosh, my gosh, what a pleasure to sit in your classes. I'm sure for your students, your soothing voice and command of the subject is just, it's just astonishing. Thank you so much. My question is in the oration, just above the section that you referenced about the feeding the cock and such. He says, when we are finally, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. When we are finally lighted in this knowledge by natural philosophy and nearer to God are uttering the theological greeting, that is, thou art, we shall likewise in bliss be addressing the true Apollo on intimate terms. Now that reminds me of the Upanishadic thou art that. And then I wanted just a little bit more. He says, he will first enjoin us not to sit on a bushel, that is not by unoccupied sloth to lose our rational faculty, but by which the soul measures, judges, and considers all things. But we must direct and stimulate it unremittingly by the discipline and rule of dialectic. I was wondering if you could say a bit more, explain the dialectic, describe it a little bit more. And in that regard, I'm also concerned about interested in the terms cherubs, sephrons, and thrones, because they're referencing a state of mind. So that it's not just a pure, I don't think the dialectic is a pure, just reason, but there is an almost affective, if you will, probably the wrong term, state of mind that accompanies those meditations and discussions.
Okay, you're asking a very important question, and let's see if I understand the question. I want more to be explained about the dialectic. Is it a state of mind? It's clear that Pico is enjoining everyone not to be passive, that in his view, being a Catholic Christian, which he is, but he's also a universal thinker, is that being passive and saying, well, I'm just going to sit back and let God or Jesus do it. I mean, this is nonsense. So if we are, especially if we're educated, or even if we're not, we do what we can. And when we engage in discussion, we try to constantly move upward on a spiral. It's like in the symposium, when Socrates consults the oracle, the wise Diotima, and the oracles were always women. Maybe they were ultimately wiser, even though they weren't generally educated in ancient Greece. Diotimus says what eros really is a move upward on the dialectic toward the perfect beauty and love, and that when one engages in discussion with a real friend, and platonically, of course, we're talking about love as friendship. We're not talking about the physical act at all. It's clearly rejected in the symposium. Homosexuality is rejected, for example, but dialectic always moves the mind upward, just like I remember once Raghavan Iyer would say, it's like shifting into a higher gear when you're driving a car, and something higher can come of it than was originally started. Yeah, I mean, we might start out on a rather simple level. I mean, somebody might say something that's even rather foolish. I mean, actually being wrong can be as helpful as being right in the dialectic. I mean, like in Plato's dialogues, like Meno is a fool, but he offers Socrates a great opportunity to teach. And some of the other, people in the dialogues are rather foolish, but they have a chance to learn from Socrates. So that's what I think the dialectic is. And of course, Plato, really, he offers different forms of dialogue in his different 36 great works. And well, there's a lot that can be said about the dialectic, but without it, we don't have real collegiality at all. And so I think that's why the Florentine Academy included Platonists, Aristotelians. It presented itself as very much Catholic. It had the Lorenzo de Medici as its patron, and that's why it survived as long as it did. It survived until 1499, I think, and after that, I guess it wasn't able to survive. And of course, there's something else I wanted to say about dialectic, but there are probably other people that have better things to say. But it's always a movement upward on the scale of knowledge, I would say, as in the 4 stages of the dialectic in Plato's cave. It's a move toward an oasis, and it can't be done without inclusivity. I think that's also very important.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions about that? Or
You got a hand from Laura.
yeah, Laura, hi.
Well, I was thinking the dialectic, one of the reasons why it is so valuable too, is that in our search for truth, and truth we know is not in the words, it is in contemplating the words. And so when there's a free flow dialectic taking place, we can reach beyond the words through the questions and through the answers. And as you indicated, spiral up towards the truth. We spend our time searching for truth rather than expounding whether we found it or not.
Yes, exactly. I would agree with that. And even the ancient rabbis had an idea of dialectic, which is in the Talmud, the commentaries on the Torah. There's the idea of the 4 partes, shot, literal. I think HPB mentions this. Taking the Bible literally is for the most part, kind of absurd. I mean, you don't think the whole human race started with just 2 people. And we know, where did all the folks come from that Cain founds a city with? And then the idea of really Ramos looking deeper into the words, and then the idea of drash, allegory, and then the idea of sod, or Kabbalistic secret teaching that only a few are initiated into. So I think that there is also a Jewish dialectic as well as the Greek idea of it. The rabbinical dialectic is very interesting. So I think these are very important and true points. Thank you. See, was that Jeff Clark?
Yeah,
in
hi,
Japan?
Judy, this is really fascinating to hear on the other side of the world. And, Barbara Tuchman wrote the book March of Folly about, periods of time where people were repeating mistakes, not just making one big one.
Mm-hmm.
And the first one she chose was Renaissance Italy. The papacy is exactly the time that Pico de Mirandola was active. And it was a time really where the church was intoxicated, just doing all kinds of stuff that, eventually led to the Reformation. But I wonder, in the middle of this, when you think of the other messengers from the Brotherhood, they lived a long time. I mean, HBB somehow managed to live into her 60s, and not everybody maybe, but even like Cagliostro lived, a long time. And here we have Pico de Mirandola dying or being poisoned, perhaps so young.
31. Yeah.
Yeah, 31. I mean, and one thing is just like he was writing these amazing works in his 20s. The only other person I can think of who was Proclus, the great, the sort of final Neoplatonist. In his 20s, he was already writing great works. And I don't know if he was the incarnation or anything like that, but I guess I'm wondering he was really challenging the crazy Catholic Church face to face, right. Was that necessary for his mission? Was it kind of part of his being young and, I'm going to go for it sort of attitude? Or I sort of just wondered what were the dynamics of his mission that led him at such a young age to just challenge authority so powerfully in that way.
Yeah, well, the question is, what were the dynamics of Pico's mission that led him to challenge the church so powerfully? Well, he does challenge the church, but he is very polite in the oration. I mean, he starts out, most reverend fathers, and he refers to them as my learned doctors, and maybe you'll disagree with me, and then he goes on and tries to defend that it really should be part of the Catholic tradition, that all these other people that are, Neoplatonists and Zoroastrians, after all, the three magi in the Bible are supposedly Zoroastrians, and Jews who were, of course, even tortured by the Inquisition just for being Jews and not permitted to own land in Europe, and were extremely tormented, pogromed out of Spain eventually in 1492. This all the same period. And, here he is extolling right in their faces the works of these people, and saying that, we need to include all their ideas. Well, I think it's because he was an initiate into the mysteries. I mean, he refers to Origen, that I think I talked about with this group earlier, who was a Christian father, believed in reincarnation. And I think he is referring directly back to Jesus of Nazareth, who was a master initiate. We don't know exactly who he was. Maybe he lived 100 years before the Common Era. There's actually a book defending this idea because of information from the Dead Sea Scrolls. There was a being called the Teacher of Righteousness about 140. And of course, HPB says that the four Gospels are mystery documents.
Mhm.
So there's no doubt that there was a lot imparted to the direct apostles, the disciples who were all martyred, that was not published. Of course, the Sermon on the Mount was very public, very basic Christian teaching, which many Christians didn't pay any attention to because of its nonviolent nature. But I think his mission was inherently to bring back the ancient teachings of the adepts into the mainstream of the Western world. And of course, the power then was in the Catholic Church, but it was about to get cracked by Luther in 1517. But we know this led to these horrible religious wars, and were Christian kings and were killing Christian kings, and also to the Inquisition. And Pico's friend, incidentally, Savonarola, who was kind of a scriptural fanatic, who was saying a lot of things the Catholic Church was doing and saying weren't scriptural, he was burned up in the most horrible way. And they probably would have killed Pico in the same way, but they just poisoned him. They don't know who did it. Maybe it was one of the Medici that didn't like him, or maybe it was somebody in the church, but he and his friend Pomponazzi were found dead. And Pico would have had to have gotten out of Italy, and probably if he could have gotten to Holland, he would have been safe. That was about the only safe place in those days in Europe, to the Netherlands. But I think he had a profound mission, and he had a great deal of anamnesis at an early age. As I said, to be accepted at the age of 19 by a rabbi of that distinction, he must have just impressed that rabbi incredibly. A Catholic boy, and it's just incredible. There are other questions.
Yeah, the rabbi may have been an initiate too, and
Yes.
knew everything when he saw one.
Many of them were. Very high beings that are in HPB's glossary, such as Hillel. There are many either adepts or very high beings among the rabbis.
Okay, thanks. That shows some light. It's just he had such an unusual life. I mean,
He did, yes.
31 years. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, it'd probably make a good movie, but it's never been made. There is one about Cagliostro, but it's not very accurate.
They should have read HPB.
Yeah, Jim, I think that's Jim Tipfer.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay, I think it's. Yeah, I think it's an interesting question about his life and the length of it. But I think if a perspective could be that it isn't, as we know, so much the length of the life, but the depth of what he was doing could have been so fundamental in terms of dealing with the thought form of his age. And therefore, what he was doing at a subtler, more sublime level is such that it released something for centuries to come in terms of a kind of swirling benevolent influence, and in kind of inspirited a lot of people over the course of the next several centuries. But the point of it is his contribution perhaps was so profoundly deep that it can't be measured in terms of how short his life was, because in a sense he did far more, or in another way of looking at it, he discharged his deeper purpose in a shorter period of time And so it led to his life being lost, but it wasn't anything was lost in terms of a missed opportunity, because what he did was so profoundly important.
Yes, that's exactly right. And certainly he knew his soul went on under karma. He will return. I mean, it's almost as if he's the adept Jesus of Nazareth returned, just to say, well, there are about 2,000 things wrong with what you call my church, but I'm going to give you 900 because I don't want you poor old daughters to have to read them all. And I don't know if that's true or not, but you're quite right that short life, Jesus of Nazareth lived to be only 33, according to the Christian scripture. Of course, we don't know exactly who he was. Whoever he was knows who he was, I'm sure. But he completed his mission. I mean, Shankaracharya lived to be, what, 38? And he completed his mission. And so it's not the length of life is so important as the quality of life. And some of us, it takes longer. And some of it's perhaps in a shorter time. But it does make you think a little bit differently about life. It's sad when a young person dies. It's sad to lose them, but on the other hand, what he did is quite immortal, and I think it's going to become more and more important as this cycle continues, and people understand what humanism really means.
Yeah, we're very much bound up with length of life for various reasons, but the parallel, in a sense, at the intellectual, simply at another level of things, is Ramanujan in mathematics. He died at what, 31, 32?
31.
But they're still working out the contributions he made in the last year of his life when he had returned to India and was in the middle of chaos with his mother and his wife, and he's spinning out these theorems that they discover later, and they're still working on them. They're so fertile that they're still continue to make contributions for whole decades and a century later. So it's how fundamental it is that really has to do with the wider contribution beyond the physical life.
Exactly. Apparently, Ramanujan died so young because of the food in England that he wasn't really able to continue to live. I mean, they were feeding him things that he couldn't eat, and apparently his health failed very badly in England. So he didn't live very long, unfortunately.
Yeah. If his mother hadn't blocked his wife coming, I think it would have made a vast difference to his longevity and his health and his and everything. It was just sad. It was very tragic.
Yeah, it was. But again, perhaps there was a completion of what he had to do.
Yeah.
And
you can think of how much Judge got done between 1886 and 1886.
Yeah.
10 years with that Path magazine and founding over 100 lodges in the North America. So it seems like if a person really catches fire, a lot can happen.
Of course,
in a short period of time.
Well, Judge was in Nirmanakaya or close to it, so I guess he had extraordinary abilities in in industry. But I mean, that body clearly wasn't able to hold that energy for much longer than it did.
And as Crosby says, it kind of reminds us never forget that the Mahatmas are always kind of working in the background,
Exactly, and I definitely feel that about the Florentine Academy, that they were perhaps financially supported by the Medici, who had some interest in Platonism. Like I said, they were pretty awful, but maybe they weren't all bad. And but there were clearly, I think, adepts behind this movement, which I was constantly arguing with Louis Spitz at Stanford that it was much more important than the Reformation. I mean, to the whole intellectual, spiritual outlook of the Western world. As I said, there's not hardly any difference at all between Anglican Catholicism and Roman Catholicism. And there's very little difference, I think, between Lutheranism and Catholicism. My teacher, Berger Pearson, who was a Lutheran, said at one time in a lecture, he said, well, after all, I'm close to being a Catholic. And he was a Lutheran. I mean, after all, Luther really wanted to be Catholic, but he just couldn't agree with him. So he had a great deal of courage, but he also went ahead and let the nobles slaughter the peasants, or he would have gotten it. And it led to a lot of real horrible things.
That seems to be a common denominator between these remarkable beings, is their courage, doesn't it?
Yes. Their great courage, yes. So Luther, spite of the fact that he was rather imperfect, did have a great deal of courage. And I remember standing in that church in Wittenberg in Saxony in Germany, and I could just feel a kind of energy where he made these statements that he was not going to knuckle under to the Inquisition. And of course, he was under threat of auto da fe, but he had support, so he wasn't killed like John Huss was murdered. And later on, there were Protestants that murdered Giordano Bruno for promulgating that the universe was infinite. I mean, he got auto da fe in Geneva. So it wasn't just the Catholics that were doing these awful things. There were some pretty horrible things happening in the name of Christianity, which really were not the intention of its founder, obviously.
I've raised this as more of a question, kind of something I'm musing about here that we're discussing, Judy, but we tend to look at death or a short life in a rather lamentable event. But it's possible to pivot thought a bit and wonder, couldn't that also be something significant about someone? Everyone's death is significant in some deeper sense. And therefore, there has to be a special meaning to the death of any high being. It's not just a death in the ordinary sense. It's a release of something that itself can be beneficent. So the very act of dying, the very fact that someone seems to die tragically, is our interpretation. And in one sense, it is tragic. That's not to subtract from that. But because things are multidimensional, multi-layered, there are deeper planes involved. We can see that as working off all karma. We can see it as working on collective karma. We can see it in a whole number of ways, such that Pico's death, even though it might have been precipitated by an evil act, itself still did something that we cannot understand necessarily, but we can presume with some reasonableness that it's also had its benign effect. It also did something. We just are not in a position to speculate much on what it was. But since every death is significant, and this is deeply significant, we can see it in a better light with that attitude, that and go as we do and say, and in addition to that, in addition to an incredible life, also there's something about his death that did its own magic, its own good. People made him more heroic that way. There are a number of things that come out of it that could be very salubrious.
Yes, and at least he avoided the most horrible death that the Inquisition could have given him. Well, all I can say is my husband used to say, I hate getting old, but it beats the alternative. So maybe for us more average people.
Technically, our time was up 6 minutes ago, but there is time.
Okay.
We could make time for Jeffrey to get his last question in there. Would you like to do that, Jeffrey?
Okay.
I don't know. I think it's impossible for ordinary people like myself to judge whether a death early or late is good or not, whether the results of that are going to be favorable or unfavorable. I don't see what we can use as a basis for making that unless we're initiates who can see karma. You know, but I mean, we say that Elvis dying young maybe made him more popular or gave him rides on UFOs or whatever. But, you know, my bringing that up was more because there are, you know, people who, I think you mentioned something like Jesus, according to the story in the Bible, he died young. But initiates who have been the messengers tend to last a lot longer than 31 years. And I can't help but feeling about the murder, if it was a murder of Pico Della Mirandola, that it was creating very serious karma. Here's somebody who, from his youth, was a very, you know, a great teacher, could articulate things, obviously was born with tremendous accumulations, had the courage, as you said, to share them and speak out. And then they just poison him. And that seems to be the way. I can't think of a story like that in East Asia right offhand. They must exist. But, you know, the West has a way of killing off adepts if it can. You know, whether it's Socrates and both Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle moved out of Athens just because he said he didn't want to give them a second crack at, you know, at committing the similar crime to what they did to Socrates. So
yes, well, he might have restrained Alexander the Great from destroying Greece. He went instead and just murdered everybody in Persia. I mean, they should have been called Alexander the Vandal, according to B.P. Wadia. But he might have had some positive influence on Alexander, who was a pretty hopeless, wild character. And he died quite young as well before he could do any more damage. So, of course, many of his generals, like Ptolemy and, you know, Antiochus, took over areas of Egypt and Palestine, now Israel. So he had a lot of influence.
Would it be okay if I wrap up the meeting here? I just wanted to read a few of these comments here from Sue Prescott. Once again, a wonderful presentation. I love hearing your talks as well as your informal comments. You are so knowledgeable, very appreciated. From Laura, thank you, Judy, for sharing your work and study. It is very helpful to our greater understanding.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Judy. I enjoyed your talk as well. Says Shefali Vatsa to everyone. And very informative and inspiring. And I want to read something here from one of my favorite writers, The Mighty Pen of Monica Page. Listen to this writing. Thank you so very much, Dr. Judy, for such a wonderful, in-depth presentation. Once again, you open the door to these incredibly brilliant beings on the world stage, giving us a new understanding about the sacred scholar path and its connection to theosophy. Much gratitude. So,
Well, salutations, sister and brothers, and salutations to the adepts. Yeah.
I don't think I've ever heard, I mean, to your discussion of the dialectic and what it is, and the conversation that ensued after that about the dialectic. That is a lot of concise and inspiring wisdom about the dialectic all in one place. So I'm glad we caught that on tape. So,
well, we've got engaged in it.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dr. Judy, for presenting.
Thank you so much, Judy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, brothers,
Thank you,
sisters.
Judy.
Yeah. Okay. Good night. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you,
Good
Jonathan.
night.
Good night.
Next
Good night.
week, the
Good night.
lotus. Next week is the symbolism of the lotus. So Alex Bianchi. So
Look
all right.
forward to it. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Okay.
Bye.